Labor more than land or capital has always been the quiet engine of economic transformation, and the journey from serfdom to capitalism is not a story of sudden liberation, but of slow, uneven renegotiation of power between those who worked and those who commanded work. When I look back to medieval Europe, I do not see an economy waiting to be freed by markets. I see a tightly bound social order where labor was not a commodity, but an obligation inherited like soil and status. Serfs did not sell their labor in any meaningful sense. They owed it. Their work was anchored to the land, enforced by custom law and violence, and justified by a worldview in which hierarchy was natural and mobility dangerous. Feudal labor systems were designed for stability, not growth. In a world of limited technology and constant insecurity, tying workers to land ensured predictable output and social control. Lords extracted surplus through rents and labor dues, while peasants traded freedom for protection. This arrangement was not efficient, but it was resilient within its context. What broke it was not ideology, but shock. The Black Death in the 14th century tore through Europe's population, killing perhaps a third or more of its people, and in doing so it shattered the balance of labor supply and demand. Suddenly, workers were scarce. Land was abundant. The arithmetic of power flipped. This transition was uneven and deeply geographic. In Eastern Europe, where land remained plentiful and states were weaker, serfdom intensified rather than declined. Labor was rebound, just as it loosened in the West. This divergence matters because it reminds us that capitalism was not inevitable. It was conditional. Where markets expanded, cities grew, and states centralized, power labor could be monetized. Where these forces lagged, coercion persisted. Capitalism did not abolish unfreedom. It rearranged it. The rise of cities accelerated this transformation. Urban centers needed workers untethered, to land able to specialize, to learn crafts to respond to demand. Guilds emerged as intermediaries, protecting skills and limiting competition. For workers, this was both opportunity and constraint. Guild membership offered security and status, but also rigid hierarchy and exclusion. Labor was freer than serfdom, yet far from free. What mattered was that work began to detach from identity. A person was no longer defined solely by birth and land, but by skill trade and contract. The true rupture came with early capitalism's hunger for flexibility. As commerce expanded and production scaled, fixed obligations became obstacles. Employers needed labor they could hire and dismiss, intensify, and relocate. Enclosure movements in England transformed common land into private property, displacing peasants and forcing them into wage dependence. This was not progress experienced as liberation. It was experienced as loss. The countryside emptied not because workers desired factories, but because survival required cash. Labor became free in a legal sense precisely when it became economically compelled. Industrialization completed the transformation. Factories concentrated workers under one roof, disciplined by clocks rather than seasons. Time itself was monetized. Wages replaced customary rights, but they also severed the safety nets embedded in older systems. Early industrial labor was harsh, dangerous, and unstable. Yet it was scalable, and scale is capitalism's defining feature. From the perspective of capital labor, had finally become mobile, divisible, and comparable. From the perspective of workers, insecurity replaced obligation, and survival depended on continuous employment. What fascinates me is how quickly societies reintroduced controls once labor became too volatile. Workhouses, vagrancy laws, and company towns merged to manage the new risks of a free labor force. The state which had once enforced serfdom now enforced contracts and property rights. Freedom of labor did not mean absence of power. It meant power exercised through markets rather than chains. This distinction is subtle but crucial. Capitalism did not remove domination from labor. It abstracted it. By the 19th century, resistance took new forms. Workers organized not to return to feudal obligations, but to stabilize capitalist uncertainty. Trade unions, strikes, and labor parties emerged as collective responses to individual vulnerability. The demand was not to abolish wage labor, but to civilize it. Hours, safety wages, and security became political questions. In this sense, modern labor rights were not anti-capitalist. They were corrective attempts to reconcile productivity with dignity. Looking across this long arc, the evolution from serfdom to capitalism reveals no straight line toward freedom, only shifting constraints. Each system solved certain problems while creating new ones. Serfdom guaranteed subsistence, but crushed mobility. Capitalism unlocked growth, but normalized insecurity. Labor's history is therefore not a march toward emancipation, but a continual renegotiation of who bears risk, who controls time, and who captures surplus. And it is at this unresolved tension between freedom and dependence that the modern world still stands today. Because even now, labor remains caught between legal autonomy and economic necessity, between the promise of choice and the reality of constraint. And the story continues as industrial capitalism gives way to new forms of work that appear freer on the surface, but may conceal deeper dependencies beneath, as the meaning of labor itself begins to shift toward new configurations that test old assumptions about freedom, security, and value. As industrial capitalism matured in the 20th century, societies attempted to resolve the instability of wage labor by embedding it within institutions. The welfare state, collective bargaining, and long-term employment contracts emerged as buffers between workers and the market's volatility. For a time, especially in the decades after World War II, this compromise appeared durable. Labor traded flexibility for security. Employers accepted regulation in exchange for predictability. Risk was shared more broadly, and the memory of mass unemployment kept excess in check. This was capitalism disciplined by history, yet stability carried its own tensions. As globalization intensified and technology advanced, the rigidities of this system became visible. Firms facing global competition sought to shed fixed labor costs. Automation reduced demand for routine work. Capital became mobile in ways labor could not easily match. Once again, conditions shifted faster than institutions. The response echoed earlier eras. Labor was freed once more, not into independence, but into precarity. Temporary contracts, outsourcing, and platform work expanded under the language of choice, reviving an old pattern where legal freedom masked economic compulsion. The gig economy did not invent insecurity, it repackaged it. Where the serf was bound to land and the factory worker to the clock, the modern worker is bound to algorithms, ratings, and fluctuating demand. Control is less visible, but no less real. Income becomes unpredictable. Benefits fragment. Responsibility shifts from employer to individual. History teaches us to recognize this move. Risk is being reassigned downward. Just as enclosure forced peasants into wage labor, digital platforms externalize uncertainty while capturing value. The form has changed. The bargaining position has not necessarily improved. At the same time, new forms of labor power are emerging. Knowledge work, remote employment, and global connectivity allow some workers to transcend local constraints. Skills once rare can command global wages. Yet this polarization reinforces inequality within labor itself. Those with adaptable skills gain autonomy. Those without face intensified competition. Capitalism once again differentiates labor, rewarding flexibility while penalizing dependence. The system does not eliminate hierarchy, it refines it. What remains constant across centuries is the central question: who bears risk? Under serfdom, risk was absorbed by custom and community at the cost of freedom. Under early capitalism, risk shifted to workers in exchange for mobility. Under managed capitalism, risk was pooled through institutions. Today, risk is being individualized once more, even as the shocks facing workers, pandemics, automation, climate disruption, grow more systemic. This mismatch between individual exposure and collective threat is historically dangerous. It is precisely this imbalance that has in the past produced social unrest and political transformation. The lesson from the long evolution of labor is not nostalgia for any past system, but clarity about trade-offs. Freedom without security breeds fear. Security without freedom breeds stagnation. Sustainable labor systems emerge only when societies consciously decide how much risk individuals should carry and how much should be shared. Markets alone do not answer this question. They merely express the current balance of power. When that balance becomes unstable, change follows, whether gradual or explosive. As the meaning of work continues to evolve from lifelong employment to fluid tasks, from physical effort to cognitive and emotional labor, history urges caution. New arrangements may feel innovative, but they echo old patterns. Labor has always adapted, resisted, and reorganized in response to shifting structures of power. Those who understand this lineage are better equipped to see beyond rhetoric and assess where true leverage lies. If this exploration of labor's journey from serfdom to capitalism has sharpened your understanding of work in the modern world, I invite you to subscribe and continue these historical reflections with me, and to leave a comment sharing where you see the next great shift in labor power emerging. Because history shows that when the structure of work changes, society itself is never far behind.